This happened just last week during my final week at home before heading back to college. I've been debating whether to even write about it, but I can't stop thinking about what might be happening at home. My parents recently moved after I graduated high school. They'd been talking about downsizing for years, and once I was heading off to college, they finally pulled the trigger. The timing meant I'd only been to the new place a handful of times. Marcus and Linda had given me the basic tour when they first bought it, pointing out where everything was and explaining some of the quirks of an older home. One thing they specifically mentioned was that the house didn't have a basement, just a crawl space for utilities. They seemed pretty definitive about that, so I never gave it much thought. Marcus and Linda had left the night before for a week-long vacation, so I had the place to myself. The first night I noticed anything strange was a Tuesday. I was lying in bed trying to fall asleep when I heard this tapping sound coming from directly below the floor. It was consistent both rhythmically and volume-wise. At first I thought it might be the heating system, or maybe pipes settling, but it didn't stop, which made me second-guess myself. I should mention that the room I'm sleeping in is on the first floor of the house, so the sounds were definitely coming from underground. I got up and walked around the room trying to pinpoint where exactly the sound was coming from, but it seemed to be coming from everywhere beneath the floor. What made it so disturbing was that according to Marcus and Linda, there was supposed to be nothing down there but a crawl space. The idea that I was hearing sounds from below ground level when there supposedly wasn't any livable space down there was genuinely unsettling. Eventually, the tapping finally stopped, and I was able to fall asleep. When I woke up the next morning, I figured that would be the end of it. I had probably just been hearing old house sounds or an animal scuttling around in the crawl space, but I was dead wrong. Later that night, around the same time, I started hearing that same tapping sound again, only this time it was noticeably louder. I explained it away and just went to sleep. But I remember feeling a lot more uncomfortable that night than the first. When the noises started up a third time in a row, I knew something was seriously wrong. There was a considerable escalation that night. Instead of just tapping, I heard dragging and scraping sounds too, like some kind of animal raking its claws against something and occasionally dragging something. That's the best way I can describe what I was hearing. I kept trying to rationalize what I was hearing against what I knew about the house. The logical part of my brain kept insisting there had to be a reasonable explanation, but I couldn't think of one. The sounds were way too clear and way too purposeful to dismiss away as normal house sounds anymore. I started wondering if maybe Marcus and Linda had been wrong about the basement thing, or if there was some kind of utility access I didn't know about. Either way, it was freaky sitting in that dark room with nothing but scraping and tapping to keep me company. The next morning, I told Marcus and Linda about what had been going on. Marcus immediately told me to check the crawl space for animals, worried that maybe something had gotten in there that shouldn't have. I really didn't want to check down there, but figured I didn't have much of a choice. The crawl space entrance is right under the porch, so I had to get my hands dirty to investigate it properly. And although I was holding my breath the entire time, terrified at what I'd find down there, there was nothing, not even any animals. Marcus seemed satisfied with that explanation and told me not to worry about it anymore. But personally, I was unsatisfied and honestly kind of frustrated with the lack of answers. I decided to look for other possible explanations. Maybe there was some kind of external access around the house I'd missed, or evidence of animals getting in somewhere else. As I was walking the perimeter, I noticed a pile of old construction materials leaning against the side of the house. Lumber, tarps, concrete blocks, stuff like that. They looked like they'd been there for a while, maybe left over from some previous renovation project. It wasn't like I hadn't noticed the stuff until then. I just always kind of overlooked them since I never had a reason not to. I started moving materials around, thinking maybe they were covering up some kind of opening that animals could use to get under the house. What I found instead was much, much worse. Hidden behind the construction materials was a storm door that had been completely concealed. It was partially painted over, and obviously hadn't been used in a long time, but it was definitely a legitimate entrance. I opened it and found a set of concrete steps leading down into what was unmistakably a basement. I stood there in shock. Marcus and Linda had been completely wrong about the house not having one. I didn't want to go down there. I really didn't. But I did anyway. In the limited amount of time I was down there, I realized two things. Someone had clearly been living in that basement, which I could tell from the empty food containers scattered about. And two, whoever had been living down there was not a normal homeless person, which I could tell from the markings that were scratched into the wood foundation. There were scratch marks. They looked like tallies on one of the pillars with what looked like demonic drawings on another. Drawings of people and animals, but in a seriously messed up way. Stuff I don't want to repeat here. I didn't stay down there any longer than I had to. It was, and still is, the freakiest scene I've ever stumbled upon. I immediately called Marcus and Linda to tell them what I had found. They were completely shocked and said they had no idea there was a basement, let alone that someone had been living in it. Marcus asked me 100 times if I was sure that there was no one currently in there, and I reassured him that there wasn't. Then he said they'd cut their vacation short and come home immediately. The first thing I did after hanging up was go out and buy a heavy-duty padlock. I secured the storm door from the outside, thinking that would solve the problem and keep whoever had been staying there from coming back. That same night, I was woken up by aggressive banging and rattling coming from outside. I instantly knew what it was. Someone was trying to get back into the basement and was clearly frustrated that the door was now locked. The banging was so loud and violent that I was afraid they might actually break the door down. I remember freezing up as my heart started to race. I couldn't move. The banging stopped and that unfroze me. I crept over to the window and looked out just in time to see a figure sprinting across the backyard into the darkness. I couldn't make out any details about who it was, but seeing them flee made the whole situation feel more real and threatening. The rest of the night was kind of a blur, honestly. Mostly because I was so terrified and shaken up, as much as I hate to admit it. The police did a thorough search of the house, including the basement, but obviously they found nothing. They couldn't do much beyond promising to increase patrol in the area. Marcus and Linda came home the next day and they insisted that everything would be fine now that they were back. They said they'd figure out a more permanent solution together and that I shouldn't worry about it anymore. I left for college the following morning as planned, but I was, and still am, extremely unsettled by the whole experience. It felt wrong to leave Marcus and Linda there alone, especially since we have zero information about the person who has literally been living in our house for who even knows how long. It's only been a few days since I left, and I've been anxiously waiting to hear from Marcus and Linda about whether anything else has occurred. So far, nothing has, but that hasn't put me at ease at all. I can't stop thinking about those awful markings I found in the basement, especially those sadistic drawings. I can't even begin to imagine what that person has been doing down there. If I'm being real, I'm really scared that something else is going to happen. I grew up in a small town a few miles from the Montana-Idaho border. I was on the Montana side. Nothing much ever happens out here. And honestly, that's part of why I never left. This happened a really long time ago before the whole world had a cell phone and was chronically online. To be honest, my area hasn't changed much at all since then, which is part of the reason why what I'm about to tell you is so fresh in my memory. It was the very end of August, one of those final days of summer when you can already feel the seasons turning. That morning I was driving my usual route to work, just a 2-lane stretch of highway that cuts through farmland and low hills. Around 15 minutes out, I spotted a car pulled off on the shoulder. It was a light blue older model sedan, and it looked like it had been there for a while. It was just sitting there on the shoulder. No hazards on, no one standing outside, just sitting there, angled slightly toward the ditch. Now listen, I'm no fool, but I am the type of guy to help a person in need. It's just how I was raised. As I got closer, I slowed down a bit to get a better look. The car wasn't running and I couldn't see anyone inside. No one in the driver's seat, passenger seat, or the back. It was definitely strange, especially that early in the morning, but it wasn't exactly alarming. People break down and walk off for help all the time out here. I figured maybe someone had car trouble and headed off to the nearest farmhouse, so I kept driving. I had to get to work, and it didn't seem like an emergency. In all honesty, I kind of forgot about the whole thing by the time I got off. But as I was driving home, I saw that exact same car again in the exact same spot. The only difference was that this time the driver's side door was wide open. It hadn't been like that in the morning. I was sure of it. I slowed down again. craning my neck a little as I passed. But there was still no sign of anyone, no one walking nearby. No tracks I could see, just that same old car sitting there with a door hanging open like someone got out in a hurry and never came back. That time, I didn't shrug it off. I pulled over once I had signal again and called the non-emergency line. I told the operator where and what I had seen, and she thanked me before saying someone would check it out. When I was driving into work the next day, the car was finally gone, so I figured that would be the end of it. About a week later, though, while I was eating breakfast, I saw something on the local news that caught my attention. Reportedly, the police were investigating a missing person case. Something about a vehicle found abandoned along a rural stretch of highway just outside town. The things they were saying lined up exactly with what I had seen. I instantly connected the dots and turned up the volume on my TV. They didn't release the guy's name, but they said the car was registered to a man from out of town who never showed up to where he was supposed to. The thing was, according to the authorities, there was no sign of foul play and there were no witnesses to the situation. I've always been slightly suspicious of the media, so I wasn't sure I believed the story the news people were giving. Either way, it was eerie that I had basically been witness to the situation right when it happened. Come to think of it, I might have been the first person or even the only person to have reported that car on the side of the road at all. It was definitely a weird feeling. I tried to move on with my life, but I just couldn't. The curiosity was getting the better of me. Like I said before, not much happens out here, so something as odd as this was far too peculiar for me to just ignore. The next morning, I called my brother up. I'll just call him Derek. He's a local firefighter, not in my exact town, but close enough that we usually hear about the same stuff. That's just kind of how things are around my neck of the woods. I wanted to ask him if he had any information from the police department because I knew for a fact they often communicate with each other. He told me that they had gotten some memo about it from the sheriff's office, something about a vehicle found abandoned and obviously the missing person. I asked him if the police were planning to do anything about it. He said he didn't know for sure, but that they'd probably organize a search at some point. He didn't have many details beyond that. I told him we should help out and maybe see if a few of the guys from the station would be willing to join in too. At first he was confused as to why I was so invested in the whole thing, but I eventually convinced him. And by the way, I'm not really sure why I was so adamant about it either. I guess I just felt like I had some personal connection to it. I didn't even know how we'd coordinate with the police and organize the search, so I let Derek handle all of that himself. Within a couple days, and with permission of course, he pulled something together. The police were already planning on doing a search and they appreciated the added help. It wasn't anything too grand, just a few officers, some off-duty firefighters, and me. The search was centered around a shallow wooded patch and a couple of old irrigation ditches that ran just off the shoulder of the highway. It was the kind of terrain that wouldn't look like much from a passing car, but once you were on foot, it was clear how easy it would be for someone to get turned around or slip out of sight. We split off into pairs to be as efficient as possible. I of course paired up with Derek. About an hour into the search, one of the pairs radioed in. They spotted something through a break in the brush. We all converged on their location as quickly as possible. It turned out to be an old maintenance shack, and from the looks of it, one that probably hadn't been used in years. The whole thing was half sunken into the ground with overgrowth curling up the sides. From the road, you'd never even know it was there. The door was hanging slightly open, and I could see that the lock had been snapped off. Inside, it was dark and musty, the way you'd expect an uninhabited space to feel. But as my eyes adjusted, I started noticing signs that someone had been in there recently. There were empty water bottles and food wrappers all over the place in a way that seemed deliberate. The search team spread out to check for additional evidence both inside and around the perimeter of the shack. One of the firefighters said he spotted something by the back wall, so the rest of us went over to check it out. There was a small, clean hole in one of the wooden boards just above floor level. The hole had sharp splintered edges that looked nothing like the kind of damage you'd expect from weather or rot. It looked exactly like a bullet hole. We searched thoroughly both inside the shack and around it, looking for a shell casing, a slug, or any signs of blood, but there was nothing. Just that single, unexplained hole in the wall that didn't make sense given the complete lack of other evidence. The officers radioed in the discovery to dispatch, and I could tell from their tone that this had moved beyond a simple missing person case. The lead officer gathered all of us together and said they'd take it from there. Then he specifically asked me to leave since I was the only civilian there. I felt dismissed and frustrated, but I didn't have much choice except to comply. So I left. When I called Derek later that evening, he gave me vague responses about what had happened after I left. Eventually, he admitted that the firefighters had also been asked to leave shortly after I departed. The police had basically cleared everyone out and took over the scene entirely. Over the following weeks, I waited for updates. Derek's contacts at the department claimed they didn't know any details about the case, which I found strange. The local news never followed up beyond the original missing person report. It was like the whole thing had just been quietly dropped. Eventually, I decided to drive back and find the shack on my own. I was certain I remembered exactly where it was. So, one day I drove along the highway until I found the spot where we had begun the search. I spent hours walking the area where I was absolutely certain the shack should be. I followed the irrigation ditches to a T. Everything from the terrain to the sky looked exactly the same as it had that day, but there was nothing. No shack in sight. I started questioning my own memory. I figured there was a slight chance that maybe I wasn't looking in the exact right place. But even if that were the case, the shack should have been somewhere in that immediate range. I tried a different section of the search area than another, but still found nothing. It was so strange. Stranger than I'm describing it now. I remember standing there in that overgrown scrubland, completely alone with the exception of the gentle breeze that whisked past me every so often. Peaceful, yeah, but strange. The only other explanation I could come up with was that maybe the county had removed the shack entirely. It wouldn't have been too difficult to excavate the thing and haul it away, but that seemed like an extreme response to what was supposed to be a routine missing person case. Those were the only two options, though. Either my memory had misled me or the shack was no longer there. I left shortly after that. There wasn't much else I could do, really. I was left with this uncomfortable feeling that something important happened during those final days of summer. Something I was briefly allowed to witness before being shut out completely. Every year when August ends and I feel that familiar shift in the air, I think about that abandoned car and that bullet hole in the wall of a shack that may or may not have even existed.